The moment she said, "You don't belong here," she had no idea she was speaking to someone whose silence would shake an entire aircraft from the cockpit down. The cabin of Flight 441 from Chicago to Los Angeles was steady at 35,000 feet, the kind of calm flight where passengers barely look up from their screens. But that calm shattered when flight attendant Melissa Grant stopped abruptly beside seat 2A, her eyes narrowing at an elderly black woman seated by the window. The woman's name was Dorothy Williams, 68 years old, dressed in a simple navy cardigan and carrying nothing that suggested anything beyond an ordinary passenger. Yet Melissa's tone carried an immediate judgment as she leaned slightly forward and said firmly that first class was reserved for verified passengers. Her voice clipped, rehearsed, and loud enough for nearby travelers to hear. Dorothy didn't respond right away. She simply adjusted her hands in her lap, her posture steady in a way that felt almost unsettling to those watching, while Melissa signaled subtly toward the aisle, already creating distance as if the seat itself needed to be defended from intrusion. A few rows back, a young passenger named Noah Reed looked up from his phone, sensing the shift in energy before anyone else, his eyes moving between the boarding pass on Dorothy's tray table and the growing tension in Melissa's expression. The atmosphere inside the cabin began to compress, not through noise, but through silence, the kind that forms when people realize something unfair is unfolding but aren't sure yet whether to intervene. Melissa called for a second verification without breaking eye contact, her words sharpened by assumption rather than procedure, and as another crew member approached, the interaction became a quiet performance of authority, each sentence adding weight to an imbalance no one had named out loud yet. Dorothy finally looked up, her voice calm but measured as she confirmed she was in her assigned seat, though her response did nothing to soften the suspicion in front of her, only deepened it. A passenger across the aisle discreetly lifted their phone, beginning to record without announcing it, while whispers started to spread that something didn't feel right about the way she was being addressed. Melissa leaned in closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it personal, telling Dorothy that misunderstandings like this happened often and that it would be easier if she cooperated and moved to economy so the situation could be resolved quickly and quietly. Dorothy paused again, her gaze steady now, not defensive, not emotional, just observant, as if she had seen this exact pattern before in a different time and place. The cabin's temperature of attention shifted further when Noah finally spoke up, hesitantly at first, saying he had seen her boarding pass scan green at the gate, but his voice was immediately met with a firm instruction from the crew to stay out of it, reinforcing a hierarchy that was no longer just about seating but about who was allowed to speak. Dorothy's hands moved slightly as she reached for her phone, not in panic, but in confirmation, sending a single message that read simply that it was happening again, a quiet signal that carried weight far beyond the cabin. At that exact moment, somewhere far forward in the aircraft, a cockpit indicator light blinked softly, unnoticed by most, but registered instantly by systems designed for moments like this, and in the silence that followed, Dorothy Williams remained seated, unchanged, as if waiting for something far larger than the conversation unfolding in front of her to finally respond. The tension inside the cabin did not relax after the message was sent. Instead, it deepened, spreading quietly through the rows like an invisible current that made every sound feel sharper than it should have been. Flight attendant Melissa Grant stepped back slightly from seat 2A, her posture still firm but now more deliberate, as if recalibrating control over a situation that no longer felt entirely predictable. She exchanged a brief glance with another crew member, then reached for her communication device, reporting what she described as a non-compliant passenger situation, her voice steady but increasingly layered with urgency that passengers could now pick up even without hearing every word. Dorothy Williams remained exactly where she was, hands folded, gaze forward, her calm presence contrasting against the subtle escalation unfolding around her, while the young passenger Noah Reed shifted in his seat, no longer just observing but fully aware that something about the handling of the situation felt wrong beyond procedure. A few seats away, a woman lowered her sunglasses and quietly said to her companion that the boarding pass had already been scanned at the gate, a detail that should have ended the matter but instead seemed to have been ignored entirely. Melissa returned with confirmation from the cockpit that security protocol was being reviewed, and that statement alone caused a ripple of unease among passengers who began to question what kind of escalation required cockpit involvement for a seated passenger in first class. Dorothy finally moved her phone slightly on her lap, the screen still showing a single sent message, and in that moment the subtle hum of the aircraft felt heavier, as if the plane itself had become aware of the imbalance forming inside it. The intercom light in the front panel blinked again, drawing Melissa's attention for a brief second, and when she turned back, her tone shifted from procedural to corrective, instructing Dorothy that cooperation would prevent further disruption and unnecessary involvement from authorities on board. The words were carefully chosen, yet they carried an implication that the situation had already been judged rather than investigated, and Noah could no longer stay silent as he leaned forward and stated clearly that he had watched the boarding process and saw the scan register as valid at the gate. His comment immediately tightened the atmosphere, drawing a firm response from Melissa reminding him that crew instructions were not to be challenged during active protocol handling, reinforcing a boundary that felt less about safety and more about control. Dorothy turned her head slightly toward the aisle, her expression unchanged but her attention now fully present, as if acknowledging that the situation had reached the stage where truth alone would no longer be enough to resolve it. Somewhere beyond the cabin, inside the cockpit, a second notification appeared on the pilot interface linked to passenger verification logs, prompting a quiet pause from the flight crew who were monitoring updates in real time. The aircraft continued its steady course through clear skies, but inside the cabin the energy had shifted into something more fragile, where every movement, every glance, and every word felt like it was being recorded by more than just the passengers holding phones, and Dorothy Williams remained seated at the center of it all, waiting without urgency, as if she already knew that the next response would not come from the cabin at all. The atmosphere inside the aircraft had now shifted into something far more rigid, where silence no longer felt like calm, but like anticipation of a decision that had already been made somewhere out of sight. Flight attendant Melissa Grant stood near the forward aisle, her posture straight, her communication device held close as she received updated instructions that required her to maintain containment until further confirmation from the cockpit authority channel. Her eyes returned to Dorothy Williams, who had not moved from seat 2A, and for the first time there was a subtle uncertainty in Melissa's expression, as if the expected compliance she had assumed was no longer guaranteed to arrive. Across the cabin, passengers were no longer pretending not to watch, with several devices now openly recording, capturing not just the interaction but the growing contradiction between procedure and perception. Noah Reed leaned slightly into the aisle again, his voice calm but firm as he repeated that the boarding scan had already cleared at the gate, a statement that now felt less like a suggestion and more like a challenge to the narrative being enforced. Melissa responded by instructing him not to interfere again, her tone measured but sharper than before, reinforcing boundaries that now felt increasingly defensive rather than authoritative. Dorothy's phone remained in her hand, screen still lit, and although she had not spoken in several minutes, her presence had become the center of every glance, every whisper, every pause between words, spoken by the crew. Then, without announcement, a subtle change occurred at the front of the cabin, a notification tone barely audible but instantly recognized by the flight attendants who exchanged quick looks that carried more meaning than their words. Melissa stepped back half a pace, listening to a voice through her earpiece that carried instructions originating from the cockpit, confirming that passenger identity logs were being cross-checked in real time with airline executive clearance records. That phrase alone altered the energy in the cabin, because it introduced a layer of verification that extended far beyond standard passenger management, and several passengers now leaned forward instinctively, as if distance could help them understand what was happening more clearly. Dorothy finally lifted her gaze slightly toward the front, not in reaction to the crew, but as if acknowledging something that had already been set in motion before any of them had spoken. In the cockpit, Captain Jason Carter had paused his flight monitoring routine, his attention drawn to a secure message flagged under Priority Family Contact Protocol, a designation that bypassed standard operational alerts. He did not respond immediately, but his stillness carried its own weight, and the co-pilot noticed the change without needing explanation. Back in the cabin, Melissa received another instruction, this time less ambiguous, indicating that further escalation required verification before any physical adjustment of passenger seating could occur, a directive that introduced hesitation into a situation that had been moving too quickly in one direction. Noah exhaled quietly, lowering his phone slightly, sensing that the balance inside the cabin was shifting even if no one had yet acknowledged it out loud. Dorothy remained composed, her posture unchanged, her silence now no longer passive but unmistakably intentional, as if she was no longer waiting for permission but for recognition. And above them, the aircraft continued its steady course through clear skies, while inside, the line between authority and assumption began to blur in a way that none of the crew could fully control anymore. The quiet tension that had settled inside the aircraft began to change shape again, not through noise, but through a growing sense that the situation was no longer being managed solely in the cabin. Flight attendant Melissa Grant stood near the forward aisle holding her communication device closer now, listening to instructions that arrived in shorter, more precise updates from the cockpit channel, each one reducing uncertainty but increasing the weight of what was being verified. The phrase passenger identity cross-reference with executive clearance registry had now been repeated twice, and that alone had shifted her posture from enforcement to hesitation. Dorothy Williams remained seated in 2A, her hands still resting calmly, but there was a subtle shift in her attention, as if she was now aware that the process unfolding around her had moved beyond routine escalation. Noah Reed, still seated a few rows back, had stopped recording for a moment, lowering his phone as he watched Melissa carefully, noticing that her earlier confidence had been replaced by something more restrained, something closer to doubt. Across the aisle, a passenger whispered that it was unusual for cockpit-level verification to be involved in a seating dispute, and that whisper spread quietly through nearby rows, changing curiosity into concern. Melissa finally spoke again, not with accusation but with instruction, telling Dorothy that verification was still in progress and that any misunderstanding would be resolved shortly. Yet her tone no longer carried certainty, only procedural caution. Dorothy gave a slight nod, acknowledging the words without accepting their implication, and then she looked forward again, steady and composed, as if she had already anticipated the outcome of every possible verification path. At that exact moment, inside the cockpit, Captain Jason Carter reviewed a secured message flagged under Family Executive Protocol, a designation that temporarily paused non-critical flight operations alerts and required immediate acknowledgment. He did not speak at first, only reading, his expression shifting subtly as he processed the identity confirmation request linked to seat 2A, and for the first time since takeoff, he leaned slightly away from the controls. The co-pilot noticed the change and asked if everything was within normal parameters, but Jason did not answer immediately, his attention fixed on the verification stream that now displayed historical passenger clearance records tied to senior executive authorization. Back in the cabin, Melissa received another update, this time indicating that any enforcement action must be paused pending direct cockpit confirmation, a directive that immediately altered her stance and caused her to step back half a pace from the aisle. Noah looked up again and quietly said that this felt like more than a seating issue now, his voice low but steady, and for the first time no crew member dismissed his comment outright. Dorothy finally moved her hand slightly, turning her phone so the screen faced upward for a moment, though no one could see what was displayed, and that simple motion drew more attention than any instruction given by the crew. The cabin lighting remained unchanged. The aircraft continued its smooth trajectory at cruising altitude, but the psychological weight inside the space had shifted entirely, as if the center of authority was no longer visible from the aisle. In the cockpit, Jason Carter closed the verification screen for a brief moment, then reopened it, confirming a final match that triggered a silent system acknowledgment, and in that instant his decision point became clear, though he had not yet acted on it. And in the cabin below, Melissa Grant stood still, realizing that whatever came next would no longer be defined by her procedures, but by something that had just been confirmed far beyond her control. The shift inside the aircraft became undeniable the moment the cockpit stopped treating the situation as a routine cabin escalation and began treating it as a verified identity event requiring executive confirmation. Flight attendant Melissa Grant stood frozen near the forward aisle for a brief second, her communication device still pressed close, as the latest instruction arrived confirming that no further passenger action was to be taken until direct authorization from the cockpit was completed. The words were simple, but their effect was immediate, dissolving the authority she had been exercising moments earlier into procedural suspension. Dorothy Williams remained seated in 2A, unchanged in posture, but the stillness around her now carried a different meaning, as if the entire cabin had begun orbiting a fact that had not yet been spoken aloud. Noah Reed, no longer filming, watched the crew carefully as they adjusted their positions, noticing that the energy had shifted from enforcement to anticipation. A passenger near the window quietly remarked that they had never seen a verification process extend this far for a first-class seat, and that observation spread subtly through nearby rows, turning confusion into expectation. Melissa finally lowered her voice and informed Dorothy that cockpit confirmation was underway, her tone now careful, measured, and noticeably different from earlier instructions, as if she was no longer certain where authority truly rested. Dorothy gave a slight nod, her expression unchanged, but her presence now felt heavier in the silence that followed, as if she was no longer being questioned but being recognized. In the cockpit, Captain Jason Carter stared at the secure verification screen, which now displayed a confirmed executive clearance match tied directly to family authority protocol. And for the first time, he exhaled slowly, leaning back from the console as if absorbing the implications of what had just been validated. The co-pilot looked over again, sensing the change, but Jason raised a hand slightly, signaling that he had seen enough to proceed without further delay. Back in the cabin, Melissa received the final instruction she had been waiting for, a confirmation tone indicating that identity verification was complete and that passenger status was to be updated immediately to executive clearance level. Her expression changed subtly at that moment, not into surprise, but into recognition of consequence, and she stepped aside from the aisle, no longer positioned between Dorothy and the rest of the cabin. Noah finally spoke again, softly noting that everything about the situation had just shifted in a way that made earlier assumptions feel completely misplaced, and no one contradicted him. Dorothy adjusted her posture slightly, still calm, still composed, but now undeniably centered within a space that had just acknowledged her status through systems rather than conversation. The cabin lighting remained steady. The aircraft continued its smooth path at cruising altitude, yet the psychological structure inside the plane had transformed completely, as authority was no longer being enforced but revealed, and in the cockpit above, Captain Jason Carter prepared to step into a decision that would redefine everything that had just occurred below. The moment the system confirmation completed its final authorization cycle, the atmosphere inside the aircraft shifted from uncertainty into something far more irreversible, as if the entire structure of authority had been quietly rewritten without a single announcement over the intercom. Flight attendant Melissa Grant stood still near the forward aisle, her communication device lowering slowly as she acknowledged the instruction that no further procedural action was required, her earlier certainty replaced by a restrained silence that reflected full procedural deference to cockpit-level override. Dorothy Williams remained seated in 2A, her posture unchanged, but now there was a subtle difference in how the cabin perceived her, as if recognition had replaced suspicion without any visible exchange between them. Noah Reed leaned back slightly in his seat, no longer focused on recording, his attention drawn instead to the stillness that had settled across the rows, a stillness that felt deliberate rather than accidental. A passenger near the window whispered that they had never seen a first-class verification escalate into cockpit executive clearance protocol, and that observation no longer carried doubt but realization, spreading quietly through nearby seats like a conclusion forming in real time. Melissa finally stepped aside completely from the aisle, repositioning herself with the rest of the crew, her role no longer active in the interaction, and that movement alone signaled to those watching that control of the situation had shifted elsewhere. In the cockpit, Captain Jason Carter remained seated for several seconds after the final authorization appeared on his screen, his eyes fixed on the confirmed executive identity link tied directly to family clearance protocol, a designation that required not explanation but acknowledgment. The co-pilot watched him carefully as Jason reached up and removed one hand from the controls, pressing a secure communication key that opened a private channel to cabin management systems, ensuring that all crew were now aligned under the updated status classification. Back in the cabin, a soft notification tone confirmed the change in passenger status, updating Dorothy Williams to executive-level clearance, and that sound, though quiet, altered the entire emotional structure of the space. Melissa exhaled slowly, not in frustration but in recognition of procedural closure, and she formally stepped back another half-pace, now fully outside the interaction boundary that had defined the earlier escalation. Noah looked toward Dorothy again, this time without confusion, only observation, as if trying to reconcile the simplicity of her presence with the complexity of the system that had just validated her identity. Dorothy adjusted her hands slightly on her lap, her expression calm and unchanged, yet now carrying the quiet weight of confirmed authority that required no verbal declaration. Above them, the cockpit remained silent for a moment longer, until Captain Jason Carter finally leaned forward and prepared to initiate the next phase of protocol, a phase that would not involve correction or debate, but acknowledgment of status across the entire aircraft system. The aircraft continued its steady flight path through clear skies, but inside the cabin every passenger now understood, without being told, that the center of gravity in the room had already shifted, and what came next would no longer be about verification, but about response. The confirmation from the cockpit did not arrive with noise or urgency, but with a calm precision that immediately changed the meaning of everything that had happened before it, as if the aircraft itself had been quietly waiting for this exact moment to finalize its internal hierarchy. Captain Jason Carter sat forward in the cockpit, eyes fixed on the secured passenger authority display, where Dorothy Williams was now fully marked under Executive Clearance Protocol, a designation that reclassified not only her status, but the entire handling procedures surrounding her presence on board. For a brief moment, Jason did not speak, allowing the weight of verification to settle fully into operational reality, while the co-pilot observed the shift in his posture, recognizing that the decision had moved from analysis to execution. In the cabin below, Flight Attendant Melissa Grant received the final cockpit instruction confirming that all previous escalation protocols were to be closed, and that the passenger in Seat 2A was to be treated under full executive handling guidelines, without further inquiry or disruption. She acknowledged the instruction quietly, her earlier authority fully replaced by procedural alignment, and she stepped aside completely, signaling to nearby crew that the interaction had concluded at their level. The cabin itself felt different now, not louder or calmer, but restructured, as if the invisible lines that had once defined control had been redrawn without announcement. Noah Reed sat still, no longer holding his phone, his attention fixed on the change in behavior from the crew, understanding without needing explanation that what he had witnessed was not a correction but a reversal. Dorothy Williams remained seated, her expression steady and composed, but now the space around her carried a subtle deference from those who previously questioned her presence, a shift that required no words to be understood. A passenger near the aisle leaned slightly toward another and whispered that they had just seen the entire tone of the flight change in under a minute, not because of conflict, but because of confirmation. Melissa returned to a neutral position near the forward galley, no longer engaging, her role reduced to observation as the system she reported to had already resolved the situation above her authority level. In the cockpit, Captain Jason Carter finally spoke into the secure channel, issuing a confirmation that executive protocol was now active across all cabin systems, ensuring uniform recognition of Dorothy Williams' status for the remainder of the flight. The aircraft continued its steady cruise at 35,000 feet, unaffected in motion but transformed in meaning, as every passenger now adjusted their understanding of what had occurred without needing further instruction. Dorothy shifted her gaze slightly toward the window, calm and uninterrupted, as if the outcome had always been inevitable rather than revealed, and in that quiet moment, the cabin understood that nothing further needed to be said for the balance of the flight to remain permanently changed. The moment the aircraft's internal system finalized executive clearance across all cabin levels, the atmosphere inside the plane shifted from tension into resolution, not through announcement, but through quiet behavioral change that spread across every visible interaction. Flight attendant Melissa Grant remained near the forward galley, now fully disengaged from any further intervention, her role reduced to passive observation as the cockpit authority cascade confirmed that no additional crew action was required. Dorothy Williams stayed seated in 2A, unchanged in posture, but now the space around her had transformed in a way that was visible only through the behavior of others, as nearby passengers subtly adjusted their attention away from speculation and toward acceptance. Noah Reed sat still, his phone resting face down in his hand, no longer recording, as if he understood that the moment had moved beyond documentation and into consequence. Across the aisle, a passenger quietly remarked that the entire cabin had shifted without a single announcement. Only system updates that no one outside the crew fully saw, yet everyone felt. Melissa finally stepped fully back from the aisle line, confirming through her posture and silence that all prior escalation protocols were formally closed, and that the situation was no longer under her operational scope. In the cockpit, Captain Jason Carter reviewed the final confirmation log once more, ensuring that Dorothy Williams' executive status was fully synchronized across passenger manifest, cabin control systems, and in-flight service authorization channels. He then issued a final directive that stabilized all related alerts, effectively closing the loop on the earlier verification sequence and restoring normal operational flow while preserving the updated hierarchy. The co-pilot watched as Jason's expression softened slightly, not from emotion but from resolution, recognizing that the system had reached its intended conclusion without deviation. Below, in the cabin, the shift became more visible as crew members who had previously been engaged in verification now returned to standard service positioning, their movements no longer directed toward control but toward routine operation. Dorothy adjusted her posture slightly again, still calm, still composed, but now undeniably situated within a recognized authority status that no longer required validation. Noah looked up once more toward the front of the cabin, noticing how even the tone of movement had changed, quieter, more deliberate, as if the aircraft had collectively agreed on a new understanding of where authority rested. A passenger near the window leaned back into their seat and whispered that they had just watched an entire power structure reverse without conflict, only confirmation. Melissa remained still, her eyes forward, no longer interpreting or reacting, as the system she served had already replaced assumption with verified truth. And in that steady cruising silence at 35,000 feet, the aircraft continued forward through clear skies, while inside, every remaining uncertainty had been replaced by a single irreversible understanding that nothing about the earlier moment would be interpreted the same way again. The final phase of the flight unfolded in a silence that felt different from anything that had come before it, not because it was quiet, but because it was complete, as if every uncertain variable had already been resolved and only the continuation of motion remained. Flight attendant Melissa Grant moved through the forward section with measured steps, no longer addressing any situation, only resuming standard service flow now that executive clearance status had been fully applied across the cabin system. Dorothy Williams remained seated in 2A, unchanged in presence, yet now surrounded by an atmosphere of quiet acknowledgment that required no further confirmation, as passengers no longer looked at her with uncertainty, but with the subtle awareness of understanding without needing explanation. Noah Reed sat back in his seat, no longer holding his phone at all, his attention resting on the window as the aircraft continued its steady path through clear skies, his earlier curiosity replaced by reflection on everything he had witnessed. Across the cabin, conversations returned slowly but cautiously, not about conflict, but about realization, as passengers processed the unusual sequence of events that had unfolded without escalation, only system confirmation and authority verification. Melissa paused briefly near the galley, glancing once toward seat 2A, then continuing forward, her professional posture restored, but her earlier certainty permanently replaced by experience that could not be unlearned. In the cockpit, Captain Jason Carter completed the final system review, confirming that all passenger classification updates were stable and fully integrated into the flight management network, ensuring that no further alerts would trigger regarding Dorothy Williams' status. He leaned back slightly from the console, allowing the aircraft to continue under normal cruise conditions. His role now fully returned to standard operational oversight after completing executive protocol resolution. The co-pilot observed the steady instruments and then glanced briefly at Jason, who gave a small nod indicating that all systems had returned to normal parameters without residual conflict. Below, the cabin lighting remained consistent, the aircraft steady at cruising altitude, but the internal perception of the space had permanently changed, as every passenger now understood that what they had witnessed was not an escalation, but a correction of misalignment between assumption and verified identity. Dorothy adjusted her gaze slightly toward the aisle one last time, calm and composed, as if acknowledging not the people around her, but the system that had finally reflected her true status without resistance. Noah exhaled quietly, turning his attention back toward the front of the cabin, no longer searching for answers, because the answers had already been given through action rather than explanation. Melissa completed her service pass without interruption, her movements smooth and professional, yet her awareness now grounded in the memory of how quickly perception could shift when authority was correctly recognized. And as the aircraft continued its steady journey forward through open sky, the final state of the cabin settled into something unmistakably resolved, where silence was no longer uncertainty, but understanding that nothing about what had occurred would ever return to what it once was.